This is my Xray X1. This is a 2023, and I'm going to be talking about everything that I've learned thus far. Now, I do have, this is some first-person video. I'm going to have some more first-person video toward the end, but if you want to jump over to minute 138, that's when I actually start talking about what I've learned. But if you've watched my other series races, the past ones, as of now, would have been Series Race 2, 3, 4, and 5. For 2022, you'll see all the difficulties I was having. Very first race wasn't saucy, it was a disaster. I was afraid to crash, so I was running very, very slow. Second race, I sauced the rear, car was pushing like you wouldn't believe. The following race, I went with different compounds, but the fronts were way too sauced, and then the third ones, the rear tires weren't prepped enough. But finally, as you can see, so if you've watched the other ones and you see me running now, this is much, much nicer compared to before. So right now I'm running Exotech tires, front and rear. It's the red compound. Now Exotech already matches them, so the rear compound is softer than the front. They are wider, so naturally you are going to have to use spacers in the rear. But here's the car. And I'm using a setup board so that the scales read a little more accurate, although a glass setup board would be nicer. The wing is an Exotech wing, so it's not the stock wing. Keep that in mind. We don't run the flat ones, or else if you hit the wall, you're going to go under. The rear wing is stock, though. But I'm putting on the corner weights just so you can see. At this track, the weight for F1 is 1,020 grams. So this car is actually over. I think I'm over by about 12 grams. Which is better to be over than under, because if you're under, well, you've got to figure out where to put weight or else you don't run. Now, most of you are probably not going to be running a camera, so keep that in mind. So here we go, 1,032, so just over 1,032. The weights are settling in, but it's about a 40% front, 60% rear, and you want that rearward bias to get more traction in the rear, or else you're going to be spinning out. Left and right are about the same. It's about a 20 gram difference left to right, but that's all right. I could always add a weight later on, but for now, I'm going to leave it as is. So if you look at the numbers again, that's where it weighs in, right in here. So we'll go ahead and remove it from the weights. We don't need those anymore, but look at this wing right here. I'm going to get a different wing. It's going to be it's a little heavier, but it's all right. I had the previous one actually broke, so this is another one. If you know how that happens, it's all right. Don't worry about it. If you happen to be watching this video and you were there when it happened. But here we go. So the battery is a ProTech battery. That's a shorty and low profile. It's a 4,300 milliamp hour, I think. But anyway, we have here. And tires will make or break your vehicle. So start with the rear. Always the rear tires first. Start with your compound back over there. Don't do the fronts yet. I use Mighty Gripper Black in the rear. I don't have a part number. It's just Mighty Gripper, and then there's black. There's a red, yellow, and I think a blue. One of them's for carpet. So again, there's yellow, there's blue, so get black, because the other three, black is the best one. I mean, if you put that one, it does wonders in the rear tires. And you always start with the rear tires. You're going to have to prep the tires. Don't do the fronts yet, but you want to maybe sand them a little, clean them. Do use some Dawn soap and clean them all. You could use some other agents and then just kind of run them on some fine sandpaper just to get rid of the gloss. You really want to get rid of that gloss on there and make sure they're smooth. So just rotate them on that flat surface, but then start with the rear, apply a coat, and then I seriously just left it. Once it dried, I applied an even coat with the applicator by Team's Power, and then apply the whole thing. Once it's fully dry all around, then I apply another coat, and then another coat, and then another coat every, say, hour or so. So I ended up applying about 8 coats to this thing. And then the front, I put some Mighty Gripper, then I took it off, and then after that I just used some Simple Green all around, and then I wiped everything off, and that's all. So in the front, I'm running Simple Green. That's all I did. I just cleaned them with Simple Green, and then the rear, I just used Mighty Gripper Black. You can also put it on a setup board, for example. So when your tires are brand new and lift it, you're going to notice that one side's going to slide off first. Notice how this is kind of sticking. Now the rear is sort of sliding a little more than the front right there. So that's all right. Don't worry about it, because as of now, the car actually does push. But you'll notice with the new tires, it'll really slide. That rear will just slide compared to the front. The front will grip a little better, and that's a lot better, and that's the problem. So in the front, just start with the inside when you apply compound, whatever you use, and just a small little amount, maybe half of the edge to the center, and then go all the way to the center, unless you really have to go all the way through. With the Simple Green, I actually went all around, applying it to everything completely. Now for the toe, you want about a degree out on each tire, but on a setup station, sometimes it can be difficult because of the play, as you can see. So just measure from the side to the side. So put a board or something here, a straight edge on one side and then on the other, and then just measure the distance from there and then here, and then just make sure that you have about 1 millimeter, maybe 2 more in the front, and just do it that way. That's the easiest way to do. So again, measure from here and then here, just make sure that it's wider in the front, narrower in the rear. And you want to make sure that you have toe out. You never want to have, say, zero. Zero is kind of not a good idea, especially not negative. You do not want to have negative toe, and the reason why is the car is just going to dart, because these tires are just going to like point and shoot. That's the reason why. So make sure you set that. Unless you want to be spinning out for some reason, then don't. But that's something important. And also, when you sauce the front tires, make sure you start from the inside out. But here, let me look at the length. So the length should be at maybe 18.3, 18.4, somewhere around 18.3. But here, let me go ahead and measure what I have mine on as 18.3 roughly. And they should be about the same length, left and right. Now I'm only measuring the metal part. I'm not measuring the full plastic thing. You should measure the entire thing, but 18.35, 18.4. So that's close enough. That's close enough to 18.3, which is probably where you should go. Maybe 18.2 would be fine. It really is up to you. The other thing that's incredibly important is ride height. And thank you so much for David Colbert and Nismo T for posting comments on my penultimate race series as of this video, which would have been race series 4, on giving suggestions ride height. So both of them suggested 4.5 in the front and then 5 in the rear. That's millimeters. And that works very, very well. So what works well is if you keep the front lower than the rear. And you want about 5 millimeter difference between the two. So that'll work quite well. So that's something to keep in mind when you're setting up the vehicle. Originally it was too low, but keep about a 0.5 difference between the front and the rear and you'll be set. So this was way too low originally. You don't want to be too low or else you'll bottom out in the rear. So you want to have a rake. So if it's like this and the rear's a little higher, so when you accelerate, what's going to end up happening is weight will transfer to the rear. And that's what you want. So it'll transfer to the rear, and then when you decelerate, it's going to transfer back forward. So what you're going to notice is as you're trying to take the turn, is that you'll be able to power out a little smoother and better because the weight is back here. It's in the rear. Just all in the rear. The front, there's nothing. They're just kind of rolling along. That's all that's happening to the rear tires. So that's why you want to start powering out, put that weight on the rear versus power going to the front when you initiate the turn. Right, you initiate the turn, weight goes forward, and then you accelerate. It goes back to the rear wheel, so you get that traction. So you get that grip toward the middle and the outer part. Now, I probably should have disconnected the camera, but let me just set the body back on. Now, notice the plate. This is the rear plate. Now, with F1, there's a front plate, so you're going to measure the ride height and the rear plate. So there's actually 3 points, and you want that to be pretty flat in the rear, and the height in the front gets adjusted differently, separately. That's what the shock in the middle is for, right in here. So that shock will adjust the height of the front part of that rear plate. So if you want to adjust the rear, you need to change the little kind of bushings for the axle. The shock is for this section right here, which is where you're going to measure the height. So there's 3 points. That's point number 2 for the height of the car. And then this is going to control the rear part, and you just replace those guys there, push the axle up or move it down, which will do the inverse effect on the chassis. If the axle goes down, chassis goes up, and vice versa. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. So again, there are 2 heights for that rear plate, and you have to control how it goes up and down. So the rear, the axle is going to push the rear up and down. That's what you change. You change the little bushings, versus the shock is going to change the front part of that plate up and down. And you want to make sure these are about the same height, and then the front, that is separate. You control that with the front bushings that are in the front carriers right in there. So if you want to lift it, you remove some. If you want to lower it, then you would add some, and this camera's not focusing, but right in there's some bushings. Sorry, I keep saying bushings, spacers. So the little silver, you can see the little silver there, you would just add them to lower, you would remove them to lift the car up. And those are your 3 points. So again, the rear plate, front is the shock, the rear, the axle height, that controls the rear height of the vehicle, and then, well, the front will control the front. That's pretty much it. So ride height, incredibly important. So again, you're probably looking somewhere close to 4.5 in the front and about 5 in the rear, as long as you're close enough. Now the tires are a lot wider, so the other thing that I noticed is they will rub right in there. So notice I have those spacers, that's probably about 3 millimeters. If you don't add them, when your suspension flexes like this, it'll hit that, that right there. That's where the wing mounts, so that will actually hit. So if you use some other tires, for example, a Team Powers wheels, you won't have a problem. But making the axle actually wider helps stabilize the car, so that it doesn't want to just, drift that rear, spin out. So that's something else to keep in mind. So wider rear end will help boost stabilize. Think of a triangle, right? So if you or a tricycle, when you turn the wheel, that rear part is very stable. It doesn't really want to skid out compared to, let's just say, a bicycle, which would be the extreme side. I mean, now the front, for example, if it's wider, it's not going to turn very well. But on a tricycle, again, you turn that wheel and it doesn't spin out like it would on a bicycle. Those are the 2 extremes. So as a kid on a bicycle, you would hit that pedal back, engage the brake, and then just whip the rear around the front. That's because it was narrow. Versus a tricycle, that was very difficult to keep in mind. So again, a wider rear end right here, this will stabilize the car, slow it down when rotating. So you make it wider, add the spacers. This already has about 3 millimeters on each side. It actually works out, especially with these wide tires, doesn't hit and it won't spin out as easily. That's what I've found out. So wider rear end stabilizes it a lot more going into the turns, versus a narrow front. For example, I am running the narrow, so there's a plate on top that you can swap. That's the narrow plate. So that, again, with the tricycle, if you turn, it'll turn a lot sharper. So again, if it's wide, it'll take a long time because the distance from the inner circle to the outer circle. I mean, think of the tires. The tires are wanting to travel in a circle when you're taking a turn. So if you look at it this way, okay, so there's a circle, they turn. If you look at the radius from here versus the radius from here, so the 2 circles, the closer the radii are together, the easier it's going to be to turn. The longer or the more the difference, so the shorter, the easier to turn. But if it's too narrow and you have way too much traction, then what's going to happen is when you turn, it's going to traction roll. So think of that tricycle, you turn and it's a sharp turn and it responds right away. And then after that, you just fly off, right? You just go right off the tricycle, you flip over, you go over that far end, you go over the outside. It's the same thing with this vehicle. So the front, narrow front will give you a more responsive turn. But if you go with a wider front end, it will take a really long time to make that turn, but it'll stabilize it, so it'll push a little more. So longer, more stable, less traction rolling, but it'll push like you wouldn't believe. So that's the issue with a really big one. So I went with a shorter one for that reason, because this already pushes as is. And the rear works well right now, so always focus on the rear first and then go to the front. That would be my advice. So I do have some running videos, and then I'm going to summarize everything that I've learned so far in a nutshell. But really it comes down to ride height, mainly tires, ride height, toe. Those are the biggest things. So now that orange-red car, it's actually red. It looks somewhat orange in the camera. But that is my buddy's car. So that's the car that I'm going to be sort of testing it. So there are the two cars. So before, like I mentioned, if you've watched the other races, he had much faster laps. Generally he would make a mistake or two, and that's how it managed to catch up or stay on pace. But now one of the things that you'll notice is, one, he has a lot more torque. But here we go. So I want to catch up. He went a little too wide there. Not sure what was going on. At first he was having problems with his tires. I guess he didn't wipe them completely. But one of the things that you're going to notice is he's not going to catch up on this one. And the most important thing really is I'm confident of the car. That's the biggest thing. Now, the lines are horrible. That's one of the things that I'm going to mention. Something else now that I'm getting used to the vehicle is start your turns early. So that very last turn, I actually started at that apex making my next right turn. Because if you start too close to the actual turn, it'll be too late. You're going to go too wide. So notice this one here. I started a little too late. Here I purposely went wide to let that guy pass. And then I touched that yellow plastic stuff and spun out. But here, okay, that was a little nicer, much nicer. So you have to initiate. Way nicer. Yeah, that was horrible. Oh, I remember now. I was waiting for him. So now I'm waiting for him. I'm going to let him pass, and I'm going to try catching up again. Now, at some point, I'm just going to let him leave for quite some time. I'm going to give him a few seconds there. We accidentally crashed. No big deal. But you're going to notice some of the differences. So let me go ahead and just wait until I pass him, and then I'll go to the next clip. But here we go. It's not going to take long. That is a Euro truck back there, just in case you were wondering. Here we go. So I already passed him, and once I pass him, he doesn't recover. Which is one of the things that I love about racing with friends, because I can tweak my car and then try it out, and then he can tweak his car, try it out, and then we always have sort of a benchmark. Because the driver's usually the driver. Although the driver could be having a bad day. Sometimes you have just a really bad day and you do horrible turns. But notice I'm way up front now. That was a nicer turn. That was much nicer. Let's see, how do I do here? Alright, not too bad. Could be worse. That one's good. A lot better. Oh, okay, better. See, it looks slow, but time-wise, that was fast. that was horrible. That was horrible back there. But again, still trying to get used to the car, because the car is actually drivable now versus before, where I was seriously scared of driving the car. Not because I thought it was dangerous. Well, I wasn't being dangerous to the other cars, but because I was afraid I would break it. But here I let him pass, and we do it all over again. So we go ahead and crash into him just for fun. Anyway, passed him again. That was short-lived. So let me go into the next clips.
Here I go.
Alright, so here we go at the end. There's the F1, Buddy's car right there. Got out of the way, but I'm actually looking for the white F1 right there. So he's just waiting there, and he's going to go. So here, that white F1, I was actually hoping I could follow him, but he ended up following me, and he's much faster. So he's using, I guess, my car as a benchmark, which is great. As of the time of this practice, here we're just practicing. It's just a practice race. He probably had no idea I had made some changes. So now I'm waiting for him. I let him pass, and now I'm going to catch up to him. So it looks like he wants to use my car to kind of pace his, and I'm trying to do the same. So it's just kind of funny. But here we go. So notice how we now drive, and I can actually manage to keep up with somebody that knows how to drive. There's another car. Ah, those colors are beautiful. There's another F car. So I'm going to summarize everything. Just pay attention to the vehicles and you'll see how they drive. And then I'm going to go into, toward the end, I'll have some more first-person footage from the actual car. But tires. Tires are the most important thing. Tires will make or break your car. They will. Especially if the rears do not grip very much. It doesn't matter what brand you're using, make sure that you're running a softer compound in the rear, harder compound in the front. And the reason why is if you go the opposite or if the compound are the same, you're going to have too much traction in the front compared to the rear, and that is a problem. What's going to end up happening is the front will grip better when you're taking a turn, and the rear will just spin out, which is the issue. Now, you still have to prep the tires. That very first race when I drove this Xray X1, this 2023 model, very first race, I didn't prep the tires. And this thing looked like it was driving on ice. It was just spinning out all the time. I had to drive it really, really slow. I was afraid I would break the car. So if you've seen it, go ahead and watch those races. You'll see what a disaster it was compared to now. That would be the before and after comparison. But things to do, just use some dishwashing soap, get rid of the release agent that they add so that the rubber doesn't stick to the mold. Just get rid of it with dish soap usually works. You could use some alcohol if you wanted to. Don't drink it. Then what you want to do is scuff up the tires a little. So run them on some pavement, maybe do some burnouts. Or I actually here, okay, so this pileup, I was actually trying to help them and push the cars, and I end up getting stuck. Tires, just scuff them. I actually have a wooden board, and I have some sandpaper glued onto it, and then I just run it lightly. It's a little bit of a challenge with the differential. How to spool it be easier, but you don't want to spool at the ends. You're going to be drifting all the time. But that's something to keep in mind. Once you just get rid of that shiny surface on the tire, then you can go ahead and apply some Mighty Gripper. And then once you apply the Mighty Gripper, just apply it fully to the rear tires and then just let it dry. You're going to need a few minutes, maybe half an hour. You can leave them there for an hour. If you have tire warmers, go ahead and use them. But you do that several times. Once it fully dries, you apply another coat, you let it sit again. Again, I did it about 8 times to the rear before I actually drove the car out here. And that was it. So just, whole day, do it. The fronts, you always want to start from the inside going out and do not overdo it. So start with, let's just say, a quarter of the tire, maybe a third of the tire. Then you can build up to half. If you need more traction in the front, then you can add more. What I ended up doing is I ended up just applying one coat to everything evenly, and then after that I wiped off. And then I actually used Simple Green. So Simple Green in the front tires, and then just cleaned it, and it worked. And I'm going to leave it like this. Why? Because the car does push a little, but it's controllable. And I can actually control the car, as you can see. I mean, even first-person view, well, with the exception of that crash there. Luckily I didn't break the car. But notice I'm in pursuit of this car right here and passed. But this is a pretty cool video. But that's the point. The point is you don't want to overdo the fronts. Once you overdo the fronts, you get a new set. It's the rears. Start with the rear and the grip, and then the front, just start adding grip to the tire slowly if you're using chemical reactions such as traction modifiers. Now the next thing, the ride height. Ride height is another very, very important thing. Remember, on an F1 car, just like pan cars, there's 3 points. There's the front, so if you just draw a line across the front axle, for example, so you measure the height there. That should be about 4.5. Don't sweat it if it's 4.6. It's close enough. Even if you do 4.7, it's fine because it's asphalt. Just make sure that it's about a 0.5 centimeter difference, so about 5 millimeter difference. If it's about 4 difference, that's fine, but the rear has to be higher up. The important thing about the rear is when the rear is set, make sure that rear plate is about level to itself. The way you control the front height of the rear plate, that's your center point where you, or the point number 2 where you measure height, you use that with that damper in the middle of the chassis, the one that's on top of the battery. That's where I hit the cars and I'm trying to push them off and get stuck. Anyway, now I leave. Nope, I get stuck. So you're going to measure the height there. No, I do leave. You measure the height there, and then once that is set, you go to the rear of the car, and then measure the rear of the car. The height is adjusted by those bushings that have little dots on them, so there's a 1, 2, 3, and a 4. Sometimes you can flip them, or maybe it's just a 1 and a 2, and then you flip them. Point is, so this is actually the footage before the one that you just saw when it comes to first-person view. I don't know why I put them in reverse order, but anyway, it's still fun. So there I am in pursuit of my friend, so you can see him. It's not going to last long. But going back to it, so you adjust the right height, and then once that rear plate is somewhat level, double check everything. So just make sure that you have that difference between the front and the rear, and the middle should be somewhat level with the rear. That's the way it goes. So that center damper, that's going to affect the center height, or point number 2. Measure. Now toe, you want to have about a degree toe out in the front, have toe out, do not have zero toe or toe in. The reason why is the car's just going to dart, and it's going to want to take that turn really sharp, which is going to provoke the rear end to want to spin out, which is a major problem. So you really don't want that to happen. Now, if you're using a setup station, because there is play in the wheels and tires, just take an average. So for example, let's just say you place them and then you sort of take the play pushing the tires inward, so the front part of the tire is going inward, and you're at 0, and then you sort of push them out, and then you're at a 2, you take the average. That's about a 1, so that would be perfect. So that's something that you would want to do. The other thing too that you can do is take 2 boards and then put them alongside of the wheel, and then just measure the difference between the rear part of the tire and the front part of the tire based on those boards. If you have about 1 millimeter or 2 difference, the front being longer than the rear, then you're good. That's another way of doing it. Or based on my measurements, if your link, the metal part, if the part of the metal that's exposed is about an 18.2, you should be fine. 18.2, 18.3, somewhere around there, you will be fine. But toe is very important. Make sure you have toe out. It eases the car into the turn. That's what happens. The rear, the wider it is, the more it's going to slow down rear rotation, so you're not going to spin out as much. If you're running Exotech tires, such as I am, because they're wider naturally, you will have to run those spacers regardless. So that's something to keep in mind. The front, think of a tricycle. If you make the front narrow, it's going to want to steer a lot sharper, so it's going to dart. So there I was just waiting for my friend to pass him so I can pass him again, because again, baseline. So think of a tricycle. Tricycle, very narrow front, wide rear. The rear doesn't really drift off or spin off as easily compared to, for example, a bicycle, which would be the other extreme, where if you hit that brake, that rear tire, you can really spin it, and then you can go crying to dad that your tire wore out on the second day of riding and you need another tire. Good luck with that one. Been there long ago. Versus a tricycle, you're not really going to drift the rear as much, unless it's slippery, of course, or you're going downhill and then you manage to drift, but you sort of have to stand on the rear and push it with your legs. Okay, that's a whole other story. The point is, because it's the narrow front, if you turn quickly, it's going to want to topple over, so call that traction rolling. Or it's going to dart in every direction. So if you want to slow down the steering, what you can do is you can make a wider front end. On these cars, there's a plate that goes on top that you can use to make a car wider or narrower. And then the bottom arms, there's 2 holes. You can put them on the outer holes to make them wider. So make everything wider, the car's going to push more. Make it narrower, it's going to push less. In my case, I'm running the narrow plate. And why? Because it's pushing. The car already pushes, it's fine. The front traction is good for me to make it comfortable. Maybe later, if I end up getting more traction out of the front, maybe I'll go wider so that it pushes, so that it doesn't spin out as much. But as of now, as you've been able to see, so here's something that you can do. The last series race, race number 5, that I ran before this video, if you compare the first person view to this one, you will notice a lot less spin outs here in this video versus the other one. The other one, my wife complained that it made her dizzy. Actually, one of my friends complained too that it sort of made him dizzy as well. Not sure about this one. I'm perfectly fine looking at this thing. I actually think it's pretty cool, especially since there's more cars in front, and then you can see how I pass them or get passed. But those are the basic things that I've learned with F1. I think it's incredibly fun once you get it running well and you can control it, because at first, to be honest, it was a pain. It can be very demoralizing for many individuals. So again, start with the rear tires, rear traction, and then move to the front one, start adding traction to the front little by little with whatever compound I like. Mighty Gripper Black and then Simple Green. So again, I'm using Simple Green in the front, Mighty Gripper Black in the rear. And then just do all of your adjustments. Ride height, make sure you have about 5mm difference between front and rear. The front, aim for about 4.5, 4.6. The rear, aim for about 5. If you go a little over 5.1, 5.2, that's fine. Just make sure that rear plate is relatively level to itself. Remember, there's 3 adjustment points. The front, near the front axle, that center part where the springs are, so you'll notice those little pivots where the springs go, and then the rear part near the axle. So keep that in mind. And toe, always run toe out. So, that being said, thank you very much for watching. I hope this was informative, or at least entertaining. Please subscribe if you have not. Consider F1, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you very much for watching.
Oh, my hair! My arm! My rod!